Wakey, wakey, the Kellogg's football camps are here, all over the country. It's game on. Learn new skills, make new friends, and have loads of fun at your local clubs. Grab your boots for a summer of football at the Kellogg's football camps. Parents, buy a promotional pack of Cocoa Pops, Rice Krispies and cornflakes before the end of June to claim a free day. To the Football for Kids podcast with me, Darren Rees. In this episode, we'll be delving into a subject that I have wanted to do for many months, but I needed to find as much information as I possibly could to make it a good one. It's also an episode which has been requested, quite literally, hundreds and hundreds of times. And this episode will be on the subject of the history of football. Now, before we really get into this episode, a bit of a disclaimer to kick us off, and sorry about that pun. Football is so old that there are so many different stories of when it begun, how it began, who it was, why they did it, dates, times, people, names, clubs, countries, and pretty much everything else in between, that it can become quite confusing. So I've tried to make it as simple and as clear and as accurate as possible. So I hope that you really enjoy this episode, and I really hope that you do plenty of learning. And my last request is just bear with me. Before we get into the episode properly, as always, we need to do a few of your shout-outs and your reviews. A massive shout-out and a huge thank you to every single one of you who has been writing their 5-star reviews on Audible, Apple, Spotify, and everywhere else you can possibly listen to the podcast. Every time you hit that 5-star button and write a review, it helps the podcast get up the charts, and it helps other people find it and listen and learn about the sport which they love just like you do. So thank you. Now, the first one is one that I recognised almost instantly. And it says, Daddy's podcast is the best. Number 1, Football for Kids. And I thought, that must be my son Charlie, who is football bonkers, football crazy. He literally wakes up in the morning, and before I can even say, good morning, Charlie, he starts telling me a stat or a fact about a footballer. And Charlie's review says this: I like Cole Palmer. He doesn't just like him, by the way, he loves him. And my name is Charlie. I played for Fleet Spurs, and I'm currently not playing for anyone at the moment. I'm Charlie. Bye, and you know me. I'm Charlie / Cole Palmer's biggest fan. Football emoji, England emoji, pray emoji. Win. Well, Charlie Rees, for the first time ever, a massive shout out to you, and thank you very much for writing your review for your dad on the Football for Kids podcast. And don't you worry, we're going to find you another team before you know it. The next one is from Leo, which gives the podcast 5 stars. It says, hi Darren, I'm Leo, I'm 10. I would like for you to do an episode on Roberto Carlos. Could you give a shout out to me and my best friend Casper, who plays for St. Peter's Celtic? I rate the pod 5 stars. Who do you prefer, Wayne Rooney or David Beckham? And could you do the final kids versus adults, please? Well, Leo, there's a lot to unfold there. So firstly, a massive shout out to you. Secondly, Roberto Carlos is an episode which I've already done. And if you're a super listener on Patreon, then you will be able to listen to that episode and all the other ones which are on there. Thank you very much for rating the podcast 5 stars. That's very kind of you. A huge shout out to you and your friend Casper. And who do I prefer, Wayne Rooney or David Beckham? I really can't decide. They're both proper proper England legends. But Leo, have you sent me your top 10 list of the England's greatest players of all time? Because I want to see who you think is better, Wayne Rooney or David Beckham. And don't worry, Kids versus Adults will be returning for another series in the not so distant future. I'm just trying to find the time to fit all these different ideas and features and episodes and everything else in, but I will get round to doing it. And the last one says best podcast, 5 stars, and it's from George. And George plays for Top Techers under 8s and wants me to give a shout out to Alfie, Oliver and Jacob. He'd also like for me to do an episode on the likes of Thomas Muller and AC Milan. Well, George, a massive shout out to you and to everybody at Top Techers under 8s. And don't you worry, those episodes you requested have gone on to the very, 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 very long list of episodes I need to write. I'm telling you, there's about 500 or 600 ideas on that list now. And if I make them all, Football for Kids might end in the year 2052. Right, that's all we've got time for in terms of shout-outs, reviews, messages and everything else. But if you want the chance of getting a shout-out, either leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the episodes, or please ask an adult to send an email to footballforkidspodcast@gmail.com. I can't guarantee that your review or your shout-out will be read out because of how many I receive in a week. But what I can promise you is eventually I do get round to reading every single email and message which comes in via the email address and on the website. Right then, let's get on with this episode, shall we? About the history of football. I don't really know where to start with this one, but I guess we'll have to start somewhere. And it's thought that a game very similar to football, in the way that it was played, actually began around 3,000 years ago by a tribe called the Aztecs. The Aztecs were a tribe of people from the Mexico area, and they used to play a game where they kicked a rock around a square or a rectangular area. Yes, you heard me right, a rock. Can you imagine? You see the perfect opportunity, the goal is wide open, and then you have to kick a rock into some form of a goal. I can tell you one thing, the old physio and the medical teams would be pretty busy, wouldn't they? Oh no, Pedro Xavier has broken his foot. He's the ninth player to do so in the opening 5 minutes of the game. The medical team are going to be very busy in this one. There's many players hobbling about and this game might not make it to the 5-minute mark. Anyway, that is apparently one of the first forms of football, or shall we call it rock ball. And rumour has it, he was quite popular. I mean, so the historians have said. There isn't anyone about these days who was around then who can tell us the truth, unless you know somebody who's 3,000 years old. Now, another bunch of people who played some form of football but weren't silly enough to be kicking rocks about were the Chinese. And it's reported that this was somewhere around 1,700 years ago in the 3rd century. So the story goes, the Chinese played a game called Kuzhu, which involved a leather ball which was either stuffed with feathers or fur. This was a popular game back then, and it was a game which spread across Asia and into other countries like Japan, where it was played as a part of ceremonies and big events. Another form of a game which goes back to the late 1700s and the early 1800s was a game by the Aboriginals in Australia. There was a ball which was apparently made by combining leaves and roots from trees, and it's thought that one of the main rules of the game was to keep the ball in the air. None of the other rules are known at all, so I can only imagine that they spent around 90 minutes headering and booting a football in the air to one another. Go on, Jimbo, how high can you get in the air, mate? Oh, that was a cracker, mate. Oh no, the kangaroo's got the ball again, mate. Sorry for the dodgy Australian accent, I just couldn't help myself. It's also known and documented in ancient Greece that there were forms of ball games similar to football, where a football was made out of shreds of leather and filled with hair. However, it's thought that these games were not very popular in ancient Greece and didn't take part in any of the big games or ceremonies. So, for quite literally thousands of years, there have been people knocking some sort of a football about, whether that was a rock or a made-up round object with natural resources. Humans have always found some sort of fun and entertainment in playing some sort of ball game with their feet. Football, as we sort of know it today, and how it's developed to the sport of today, apparently started in England somewhere around 1,000 years ago. Using a rounded object, people in England would play on the dusty roads and the fields and anywhere appropriate where they could kick the ball to each other. But also, all the way back then, it's thought that punching the ball was a big part of the game. Not just a goalkeeper, but everyone. If the ball came up in the air, then you could knock it one. I don't recommend anyone playing the Aztec style of football to do this. Over the next several years, it's thought that football, as it was back then, became very popular, and whole towns would get involved in the game. It would be like 500 people versus 900 people, and it all got a bit silly and very dangerous, where people would purposely hurt the opposition team members. And as the story goes, the sport was banned and didn't really come back to life again until the early 1800s. But by the early 1800s, football started to become a part of schools across England. However, it wasn't as simple as it was football and there was a set of rules and everyone played correctly to those rules. Football and rugby at the time were very similar. There wasn't really a game time or duration or a set of rules that everyone adhered to. To be honest, it sounds like it was a bit of a nightmare. You couldn't determine who was the winner, who was right, who was wrong, and everything else in between. Now, it's reported that there were two main schools in England who played football. One was a school called Eton and one was a school called Rugby. It's known that at the school at Eton, they played football strictly with their feet and their feet only. And the rugby school played what was known as the running game, where their hands were used as well. A group of people decided that there needed to be some rules decided, because if there are no rules then the game won't work. It was all the way back in 1848 that a group of men from Cambridge University tried to get all the right people in all the right places at all the right times and get it sorted once and for all. Unfortunately, they failed. And they failed miserably. It wasn't until 15 years later in a meeting in London where the first football association was formed. That is the FA, in case you were wondering. If you play for a team in England, you've probably seen their logo everywhere. If you've watched the FA Cup, well, that's them. It's called the Football Association Cup. They are the Football Association, the people who call the shots and are some of the most powerful people in football in the UK. And their organisation is over 160 years old. In this meeting, there are a few things decided on the official rules of football. There will be no hands used by any outfield players at any time. Football is for playing with your feet and your feet only. The weight and the size of the ball will be the same in every game and every match across every town in the country. These rules will be adhered to, and if you don't adhere to them, well, there will be punishment. It was also sorted in this meeting that football, as it was known, would be split into two sports. One, football as we know it today, and then rugby, which I'm sure you will also be very familiar with. However, this meeting didn't sort it all out. Football, to be truthful, was still a bit of a mess. None of the players wore any form of kit or uniform, so nobody really knew who was playing in what team. The game time still wasn't sorted. Sometimes it was an hour, sometimes it was 2 hours, sometimes it was something completely random. And back in those days, a lot of the players who wore caps as headers were not a part of the game in any way, shape or form. Football was being played a lot in Scotland by this point, and it's known that the teams in Scotland would play the game with very good passing. They would knock the ball about, moving it from one player to another, where teams in England were known for running forward and doing nothing but attacking. How things have changed. Football was a hit, a big hit. Even over 130 years ago, it was known that thousands and thousands of people would travel to watch a game between two local sides. In some cases, there would be 30,000 people gathering around a football pitch, sitting in trees, on top of buildings, and anywhere they could to be entertained by 22 men running around kicking a football. It's thought that because of how popular and how often football was played in England, when people from other countries visited, they would go and watch a game of football and be completely fascinated by it. They'd be fascinated by the sport in general and the excitement and the spectators which it brought. It's thought that this is how the game started to spread around the world, but in particular in South and Central America. People would come on ships and visit and be inspired and then take the rules and the ideas back to their homelands. And the game rapidly expanded, going all over the world over the next 20 to 30 years. So that's a good bit about the history of when it began, all the way up to the late 1800s, when football became a big part of everyday life in England and Scotland, and eventually spread across the world. When it comes to football clubs and their existence, there are all sorts of dates and times and people which claim to be the oldest clubs on earth. A couple of those clubs are Edinburgh in Scotland, which is said to have been formed in 1824, 200 years ago, and a club in Sheffield, which isn't Sheffield United and isn't Sheffield Wednesday, but apparently formed in 1855, and there's lots of paperwork to say that is the case. So I guess the message is, football clubs with chairmen and players and staff and everything else have been in existence for somewhere around 200 years, which is quite mind-boggling. Many of the clubs which we know today started in schools and universities, or were started by the people who still went to those schools and those universities. And if you listened to the episode which I made on football kits, you would have learned plenty about this on those episodes. So, when was the first football league then? Well, there was already the FA Cup by 1871, which was a long time ago. And once teams were knocked out of the FA Cup, they didn't have any official matches to play for almost a year, because there were no proper leagues in place, so all the games which did happen were just friendlies or were set up randomly. In 1888, the football leagues were formed. This is what we know today as the English Football Leagues, from Division 2 all the way up to the Championship. The English Football League 1 eventually became the Premier League, but you can learn and hear more about it on the episode I made about the Premier League. And you can hear more about the Championship on the episode which I made about the Championship. Football is a great sport, and like everything, it had to start somewhere, and like everything, it had to change at some point. Sometimes for the better, and sometimes for the worse. It's also a sport which continues to change, whether that's removing headers for brain health or introducing new technology which drives fans crazy. But I know one thing, I'm extremely happy we've got it, because it's a sport which entertains. It's a sport which gives fans, players, managers and anyone involved a purpose. It's a sport which has changed the lives of many. So, I hope that you've enjoyed listening and learning about the history of football, from kicking rocks about to forming leagues and everything else in between. If you want to learn more about the history of the sport, there's almost always a bit of history in the start of any episode, whether that's an episode I've made on a club like Liverpool or Manchester City, or in a tournament like the FA Cup, or a league like the Premier League or the Championship. There will always be plenty for you to learn, and if you've got an idea for an episode which isn't on a player, which involves some history, then please ask an adult to send an email to footballforkidspodcast@gmail.com. And remember, if you know someone who loves football just as much as you do, then please tell them about Football for Kids. And whether you're playing football soon, watching it on the telly or pitch side, then I hope that you enjoy the game. See you next time. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. And remember that Kellogg's have amazing football camps taking place throughout the school summer holidays all across the country. In fact, they're in 73 different locations across the UK. The camps are for 5 to 15-year-olds and are in partnership with the EFL, Manchester City, Celtic and Rangers with FA-approved coaches. To sign up today, grab a promotional pack of Kellogg's cereal, find the camp code and redeem a free place at www.kellogsfc.com. Terms and conditions apply.